So, all right, getting back to today's class. Let's talk about Exodus chapter 20. We're going to start in verse 18. Exodus 20, starting in verse 18. What's happening in Exodus 20? The Ten Commandments are going to be delivered. Now, starting in verse 18, what do you guys have there? Start over here. There.
When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpets and saw the mountains and smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at the distance.
Lane?
And said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die."
Moses said to the people, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, and this fear may be before you, so that you may not sin."
The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was.
Okay. At the time that the Ten Commandments were given, God descends on Sinai, and it's scary. Thunder, lightning, earthquake, all of this. The presence of God is on that mountain. And the people are what? Terrified, afraid. Moses, you go talk to God, and we will stay here at a distance. As a matter of fact, they won't even come near the foot of the mountain. They're going to stay at a distance from even the foot of the mountain. Now, Moses says that God is doing this why? Should be verse 20. To test you.
So that the
Keep
fear
going.
of God,
So that the fear of him may be upon you. So that
you won't sin.
you won't sin. Okay? God is scaring you straight right now. Okay? Because I want you guys to think about in the story of Elijah and Mount Carmel. Right? God rains fire down on the altar, laps up the sacrifice, the stones, the water, the whole thing. Right? This awesome thing. And then Elijah runs away. Right? Do you guys remember this story? Okay, Stephen talked about it in his lesson last Sunday night. But Elijah runs away because Jezebel threatens his life. And so God says, I want you to go out to the mouth of the, or I'm going to pass by you, okay? And so he hears a mighty rushing wind, but God's not in the wind. Then he hears an earthquake, and God's not in the earthquake. And then he hears what Scripture calls a still small voice, or a whisper. And that's when he covers his face and runs to the mouth of the cave, because God was in the whisper. So God has the ability to present himself in mighty, scary fashion, or in a way that we could easily understand, like a whisper. Or, in our case, as New Testament Christians, through his word. So, God is choosing to appear in a terrifying manner on Mount Sinai for one reason, and Moses tells them the reason. What's the one reason?
To scare them.
To scare you straight, so that you don't sin. Right? That's in chapter 20. Chapter 32, fast forward. Moses has been up on the mountain. He's receiving all of this law. We'll come back to 20 in a minute, but I want you to go to 32. In 32, what happens?
The golden calf.
The golden calf. Now, how do we get there? Verse 1 of chapter 32, when the people saw that Moses delayed coming down from the mountain, the people gathered together to Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us gods that shall go before us, for as for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Now, we talked about last week that it may have been common for people to wander off and just die. It was a dangerous time, scary time. People died, of misfortune all the time. Maybe that has something to do with it. One of the things that I want us to understand about this passage is that in chapter 20, God scared them straight because Moses was going to be gone for a while. God is going to deliver law to Moses from chapters 20 up to chapter 32. Then God's actually going to stop delivering the law when they make this golden calf. Okay? And he tells Moses, I'm going to wipe all these people out and I'll make a new nation out of you. And Moses is like, wait. These are your chosen people. If you want to be honored as God, basically he tells God, don't destroy them or all the nations will mock because you led them out in the wilderness and killed them. That's a short synopsis of what Moses argues back to God. And so God doesn't destroy them. But what I want you to understand is that the reason the people created this false god is because they got bored. They got distracted.
Whoops.
God tried to scare them straight at the beginning of the passage before he started delivering the law. And then, after all of that, Moses is gone for a while and they're like, we don't know what happened to him. Make us a god. And so, the first god, the golden calf, and the first false god that we're going to talk about for today, the golden calf. Let's see. We talked down here about why we have false gods. We talked about it was because we wanted to play. That's what they did in Exodus 32. Okay? The golden calf was because they got bored and distracted. Don't know what happened to Moses, but that fear of God wore off. Now, again, is God still on Mount Sinai right now? Yeah, he's talking to Moses while this is happening. But what did the people do in chapter 20? They sent Moses up there, and then what did they do? They put distance between themselves and the mountain. Right? They stayed away. We will stay here at a distance. You go up for us. By creating space between them and God, they forgot about God. And, left to their own devices, they said, let's do what we know. Let's create a God. Okay? So the first example of a false god being created in Exodus 32 is the golden calf. They're just bored and distracted. And it's really convenient for us that we have it recorded that these same people who not only were led by God into the wilderness through pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, protected by God from the Egyptians, watched God swallow the Egyptians in the Red Sea, and then were so afraid of God at the foot of Sinai that they said we could not possibly go up and talk to him. That same group of people, in a matter of a few days probably, just forgot about him. Make us a god. And then when they make that golden calf, what do they do in Exodus 32? Let's see. Sorry, my Bible closed on me. I gotta get back to it. Exodus 32, they tore off their earrings, they made this calf, and starting in verse 4, he received the gold from their hand, he fashioned it with an engraving tool, made it a molded calf, and they said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Verse 5, when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. Then they rose early on the next day, offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Now, once they did that, once they sacrificed to it and all that, verse 7, the Lord said to Moses, go, get down, for your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made themselves a molded calf and worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, this is your God, O Israel, that brought you out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people, and indeed that it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and I will make of you a great nation. Okay, and this is the story that we just gave a synopsis of. Moses said, no, don't do that. Everyone will see that you did that and say that's the only reason you brought them out of Egypt was to kill them. And so God waits. And so instead, Moses goes down, rebukes the people. Aaron throws the people under the bus. Moses grinds up the calf, makes them drink the water. You've all heard the story, okay? But the first false god was because this stubborn people very quickly forgot about God. All right? Let's go to, I got a second example. Go to Judges chapter 2. Louisa, I'm going to have you be in Judges 2. Actually, yeah, everybody be in Judges 2 for right now. We'll go to the end of Judges in a second. Judges chapter 2, beginning in verse 7. Go ahead when you're ready.
The people served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and the elders who outlived him, and who had seen all the great things the Lord had done for Israel.
Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110. They buried him within the border of their parents at Timnath Heres, in the mountains of Ephraim, of the north side of Mount Gaash.
And all the generations also were gathered to the fathers. And there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work he had done for Israel.
All right. Verse 11, Darian.
Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals.
They forsook the Lord, their God of their ancestors, who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger.
They forsook the Lord and several Baal and the Ashtoreths.
In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist.
15.
Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress.
Okay. So what we have is that these people did not know God. They failed to honor God. So we start with know God. Then they turned and served Baal and Ashtoreth, which were two false gods of the nations around them. Okay? And without getting off into what all these false gods did, it had a lot to do with fertility and harvest. Okay? They wanted rain, they wanted abundant crops, they wanted to have more kids, and these gods were supposed to be the gods of those things. Okay? Now, the reason that this is important is that it began with everybody did what was right in their own eyes, having no God whatsoever, and it ended with them assimilating to the people around them, following other gods that were not real gods at all, but that other people worshipped. So, we talked about with the golden calf, they were just bored and distracted. What are they here? Anybody? What are they here? It's obvious. I put it on the board. Okay, yeah. Forgetful. There arose a generation that knew not God nor the things that he had done for Israel. Okay? And they started following all the gods of the land around them. They assimilated. Without a God, we talked a few weeks ago about finding an identity in God. Without a God that they could identify themselves in, they started identifying themselves in everybody else's gods. The nations around them, they wanted to be like them. They have a God. We don't. So since we don't have a God, let's just use theirs. Well, it's not that they didn't have a God. They just forgot him. Okay? So first we have a people who are out in the wilderness and they're seeking for God and they just get bored and distracted, so they create a God. Now we have a people who forgot their God, and so they wanted to be like everybody else around them. The number one problem that the children of Israel had in the Old Testament was the desire to be like everyone else. They were God's chosen people, called to be different, but instead they wanted to be like everyone else. Which is why that little brief summary is a synopsis of what happens throughout the entirety of the book of Judges. They get bored, they forget God, they turn to the nations around them and they follow their gods, and so God would allow them to be delivered to those people. If you're going to follow their gods, I will allow them to overcome you. Which is exactly what Romans chapter 1 talks about, where if you pursue all these things, God will give you over to it. Exact same cycle, but written from a spiritual standpoint. If you submit your body to all these false things. Romans chapter 1, start about verse 16 through about verse 30. It talks about all these things you may be submitted to. Okay? And it's things like robbery and lying and sexual sin, those kind of things. Those are the things that God will allow you to be taken over by. Just like the children of Israel pursuing these false gods and being taken over by the people that followed those false gods. If you pursue it, you will belong to it. And so God would turn them over to it. So, again, we have false gods because of forgetfulness and trying to be like everybody else. Does that happen today? In an effort to try to be like everybody else? In an effort to try to assimilate? Do y'all know what assimilate means? Okay, there's a vocabulary where we all understand. In an effort to assimilate, we begin to follow other people's gods.
I was about to actually bring that up, that I think that this age group, that can be kind of one of the easier times for that to happen, because no one wants to be the weird kid that's left out. Everyone, like, all the other people are going to the, like, I don't know, my kids, there's a huge group of kids that are their age that all go to this one, like, mega church in Woodway or whatever, so they do stuff all the time as a huge group, and so my kids are always left out because they don't. That's hard. It's really hard to not be in the know, not have the private, like the jokes that they, whatever.
Yeah.
It's just really hard to not be part of that and to continue. And that's why I think church attendance is important, because this builds them up and it helps them remember what they're supposed to be doing, and that that's not necessarily right, even though it would feel easier.
Oh, it helps us not to be forgetful or distracted or
Right.
get bored with it, right? The other thing that you need to understand is that when the Bible talks about the people around the Jews, it says the recurring phrase is all the nations around them. Which helps you understand they were completely surrounded by other people that disagreed with them. They were the one God's people in the middle of all of these other false god nations. They were surrounded all the time. And for most of the time that they existed, at war all the time. And every time they chose to pursue assimilating, to try to be like everybody that surrounded them, God said, fine, be like everybody that surrounds them. Be a people without a God. Be a people that follows a false god. You're not going to like it. And every single time when he allowed them to follow the false gods and to be defeated in battle and to be taken slave, they went, man, this stinks. And so he'd raise up a judge and deliver them. Now, go to the end of Judges. So we go through all these stories that take that little cycle and repeat it over and over and over and over again. We get to Judges 21, verse 25. The very last verse of the book of Judges is this. In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So we began the book that way, and we end it the exact same way. Okay? The book of Judges begins with the death of Joshua and all the other leaders that were his peer group, or the people that led with him. There was no king in Israel. Everybody does what's right in their own eyes. Then we go through all these cycles. We get to the end of that story, and despite the fact that the Jews went through that cycle over and over and over and over again, it ends with the exact same cycle. Everyone doing what was right in their own eyes, which was going back to the idea that there's no God. There's no central identity of this people. So despite all that cycle that they went through in Judges, it just never stopped for the children of Israel. Now, that's the second one. The second version of a false god is for us to understand that when we become forgetful, when we try to assimilate, we create a false god. By saying that there's no God, something's going to fill that hole. Now, next week's class is going to be how everybody follows something, and sometimes what we call secularism, or the absence of a God, becomes a God. That's next week's class, so we'll get to that in a minute, all right? Last one. I want you to go to 1 Kings chapter 12. And there's other examples of the people following the false gods. These are just a handful that I picked out, okay? 1 Kings chapter 12, starting in verse 25. Now, Judges was the period before we had kings, right? Then we had a period of time where we had kings. There were how many kings of a unified Israel? Three. Who were? What were the names? Saul, David, Solomon. Good job. Now, Solomon was told during his lifetime that when he died, God would tear the kingdom in two, right? And divide it between his sons. Solomon was told that in his lifetime. The only reason God didn't tear it up during his lifetime was because of David. Because God made David a promise that his son would reign over Israel. And God delivered on that promise, but because Solomon was a lousy leader and he rejected the wisdom that God gave him, the kingdom was divided between his two sons. 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 25, is the beginning of that division. Solomon had two sons that became leaders over Israel and Judah. What were their names? Does anybody know? They sound really similar, and one of them is in bold right above 1 Kings 12, 25. Anybody got a name there? Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Good job. Okay, now, 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 25. Who read last? Did y'all read? She did? All right, so you girls right here. Verse 25.
Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Peniel.
Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David.
And if the people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of the people will return to their Lord, even to Rehoboam, king of Judah. And they will kill me and return to Rehoboam, king of Judah.
All right, pause there. Just so you guys know, I don't have a map in here, but I want you to understand, Judah is in the southern part of Israel. Jerusalem is in Judah. Jerusalem is where the temple is located, and it's where the people went to worship. Okay? That was important to go to the temple and worship. That was a big part of Jewish society and Jewish religion. Jeroboam rules the other 11 tribes, the northern part of Israel. Okay, what's now called the northern kingdom of Israel. And he says, if all of my people have to go to this country where my brother rules and worship, they may turn back to him because they're following the God whose temple is in Jerusalem. So, he is worried about what? Power. He's the king of a big nation, and he's worried that if they all go back to Jerusalem to worship, he won't have a king anymore. They'll kill me and turn back to my brother. So, here's what he does. Starting verse 28. Darian.
After seeking advice, the king made 2 golden calves, and he said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." Okay,
now, I don't know why it's always golden calves. I don't. Exodus 32, they made what? A golden calf. We're back there all over again, but now we have 2 of them. What?
I believe that has something to do with when they were in Egypt. I believe a lot of their gods were symbolized by cows or calves.
Well, yes, I do know why, Darian. Yeah. What I'm alluding to is I don't know why that's the one recurring thing that's recorded in the scripture. Baal rode a cow, commonly, okay? So, yes, cows are prevalent in false religion of this time. But I'm saying I don't know why we went from Exodus 32, the very first time that the children of Israel created a false god as a golden calf, and here we are years later. All those people are long since dead. As a matter of fact, they have that story recorded, right? And he's like, 2 new golden calves, and he makes the exact same statement that Aaron made in Exodus 32. Here are your gods, O Israel. Why is it always just the exact same thing rehashed and redone, right? That's what I'm saying. So what I'm saying is I don't know why the children of Israel go in cycles. Okay? In Judges, it was, there arose a generation that knew not God nor the things that he had done, so they turned aside to these false gods. It happened over and over and over and over and over again. And when we got out of that cycle, instead of moving on to something else, we went back to the original cycle in Exodus of, here's a golden calf, this is your God. Okay? So Jeroboam, instead of saying there is no God, creates a false God, sets it up and says, this is your God. Okay? Now, the other thing that he says here, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. It's too hard to go back and worship there. Let me make this easier on you. Now, remember in Exodus when the people forgot about God? Why did they forget about God?
They were away from him.
They were away from him. They created distance. You go up the mountain for us. We will stand over here at a distance and wait for you to come back. It's almost as if Jeroboam, and it says he sought advice. I don't know who gave him this advice, but it's almost like he went and read Exodus and went, hey, if I can just get them away from God and tell them that it's too much for them to go talk to God, they'll do whatever I want. So, in order to preserve his power, he said, it's too hard for you to go back to Jerusalem. Here's new gods. Lane, pick up next verse. Should be 26? No, 29.
Yeah. One he set up in Bethel and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the other at Bethel, or the one at Bethel, and went as far as Dan to worship the other.
31.
He made shrines in high places, and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi.
He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. He did this in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made.
33.
On the 15th day of the 8th month, the month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings.
Okay, so what all did he do?
A lot of stuff.
A lot of stuff. He basically went and remade an entire religion from scratch. So, all right, we're going to have new feast days. Conveniently, those feast days are all very soon. It wasn't like, here's a new religion and we'll have a feast day 6 months from now. Here's a new religion and let's go ahead and have a feast now. Same thing they did in Exodus, right? These are your new gods, and tomorrow is a feast day. Okay? They arose to play. Okay? Then he creates priests from every group of people. Now, why would he do that?
No one's left out.
No one's left out. Everybody gets to be a part of this new religion. So instead of just the Levites being priests, everybody can be a priest. Okay? Then He puts the gods in a couple of different places. You go whichever one's convenient for you. If you're closer to Dan or if you're closer to Bethel, then you go to whichever one's easiest. And then we have priests of every people. We have a feast ordained right away. We have offerings and sacrifices. We have convenient worship close to home, the whole bit, right? And what happened to the people?
They followed it.
They followed it. That's the reason that if you go and look at the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, you'll find that the southern kingdom of Judah had some good and bad kings. The northern kingdom of Israel had almost none. Because they didn't have God.
When you say almost none, you mean almost no good kings.
No good kings. Yeah. What he did is for the sake of his own power, for the sake of politics, he created fake gods. And he drove out the worship of the one true God for the sake of his fake gods. And all of it was for one reason. It didn't have anything to do with the people. Now he sold it to them like, this is way easier, everybody's included, we're going to have a party, the whole bit. He sold it to them, but the reason he made those gods was what?
Power.
For himself. For his own power. So he created an entire religious system out of nothing. Now sure, he modeled it some after the worship that the children of Israel had. They had feast days in the Old Testament. They had altars and certain days of sacrifice, and they had priests and the whole bit. But he also mixed it with what they had been doing for the last several hundred years, of having multiple gods, and it's easy to go to the nearest high place and worship, and we got shrines and all this other stuff. He made it easy and convenient and fun and inclusive and all of that, and it wasn't for the people, but he told them it was. Because Scripture tells us that he devised in his own head, if they go back to Jerusalem, they'll follow my brother. But when he told the people, he didn't say a word about that. He said, it's too hard for you to go down there to that southern kingdom and worship. Let me make it easier on you. So, we have the case here of, again, more false gods. Why were these gods created? Power and politics. What did Jeroboam stand to gain by creating these false gods?
Power.
Power. Control. You know, there's something interesting about a God that you make up. It can say anything you want it to. Right? If I made it up, who's really God here?
Yourself.
Yourself. Jeroboam created a God that he could control, that would give him power. Because that's what he set out to do. So in this case, it wasn't about being bored or distracted or forgetful or trying to be like everybody else. It was 100% about being in control. Does that happen today?
Yep.
Do we create gods that allow us to be in control? Sometimes do those gods have some of the aspects of true religion? Right? Like we talk about how Christianity is compassionate, but we take it way past the extreme. That's no different than Jeroboam going, well, we need feast days and we need priests and we need a certain place to go to worship. Those were all ideas of the Jewish religion. He just perverted all of them to fit what he wanted. So we take compassion and say, well, compassion is never telling people they're wrong.
I think that's how you sell it.
That's how you sell it.
Because they're familiar with the ideas, so you can sell that it's the same if the ideas are the same, even if how they come to fruition is not.
Okay, so we can take those ideas and misapply them, right? Give me some other examples.
Of what specifically?
Of parts of true religion that become perverted because we need to maintain control. 4-letter word, starts with an L.
Love.
Love. Is love essential to Christianity?
Yep.
Yes.
Do we apply it correctly in modern days? Sometimes. Sometimes we try to convince ourselves that love is this overarching theme that can rebuke all others, right? That like, because we have love, we don't really have to worry about anything else. As long as we love people, everything else falls into place. Does the Bible talk about things besides love?
Yes.
Yep.
And do those things run in contrast with each other, or should they run together? They should run together. The problem is we take love and put it in conflict with a bunch of other things. We couldn't possibly correct error if we loved it. We couldn't possibly ever tell people that something is a bad behavior or something else is a good behavior. If we love them, we won't say those things. Do we see that? I mean, am I making this up? Is this something that I'm just the only one seeing?
No.
Right? We try to say that, okay, it's really too hard to tell people to worship the right way. So because we love them, we won't. Right? Kind of like Jeroboam going, it's too hard to go down to Jerusalem to worship. So here's an easier way to do it. It was a lie. To preserve his own power. In the same way that when we say there's a right way to worship and a right way to live and a certain order to life, going back to these other lessons that we've done, a certain order to life and a certain truth about when life begins and a certain truth about the way that God has ordered the church and the household and the family. Those things matter. And love doesn't tell us not to talk about that. Love tells us to talk about that all the more in a nice way, but to stand in it because it's true. Love runs with that, not against it. But we create a false god of saying, well, love means we don't talk about those things because it could hurt someone's feelings. Love means we don't talk about that way because it could discourage someone. We have created a false god on a true God platform. We've taken something that is true about God, like love, and built a false god on top of it. Does that make sense? And it's the same thing with compassion. It's the same thing when we talk about truth. Well, there is the truth, and then there's everybody's own truth, right? Well, is it right for us to talk about the truth? Right? Yeah, we can talk about the truth. Well, Jeroboam said, well, the one true God's in Jerusalem, but it's too hard to go there, so let me build you a side truth. Let me give you your own truth. These are your gods. He knew that was wrong. Right? He knew that was wrong. And so again, we have a false god built on the idea of preserving power and control. Now, here's the other thing, and I'm running out of time, so I want to jump to this. There's a way that the Old Testament pushes back against the idea of false gods. The first was in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 11. The first 5 of the 10 commandments are how man is to relate to God. The second 5 is how man is to relate to man. So when you look at the 10 commandments, 1 through 5 are how we approach God. 6 through 10 are how we approach each other. Interesting breakdown. You guys go read it sometime and see what I mean. Okay? But the first thing that he says is, you will have no other gods before me. We talked about last week, he's saying, have no other gods in my face. No other gods in my presence. Because if there's no other gods in my presence, you won't wind up pursuing them instead of me. If I'm the only thing around, you will pursue me. Unlike the people who got forgetful and decided to be like everyone else. Unlike the guy who wanted power and control, so he created his own gods. Every time a new god was put in the face of our God, the people turned aside to the false god. So God's first rule was just don't have any other gods. We talked about last week that I don't know that you can necessarily prove that there is no such thing as another god, or at the very least another spiritual force described in Scripture. Right? God just said, you keep every last one of them out of my face. I am the one true God. I'm the only one in whose presence you will dwell if you want to serve me. He was clear about that. He wasn't about being ranked first. He was about being ranked only. Okay? Second thing. In Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 1 and 2, he says that they will be blessed by their obedience. When they pursue God, they'll be blessed. And when they don't, Deuteronomy 28, verse 15, they will be cursed. God was very literal with the Old Testament people in that when you serve me, I will bless you, and when you don't, I will curse you. And we see that play out in Judges, and again in the time of the kings, because when the people pursued those false gods of Jeroboam, the northern kingdom fell tens of years before the southern kingdom fell. Okay? And the northern kingdom had all of these terrible rulers, and they suffered significantly more than the southern kingdom did, who had kind of a mixed bag. Last thing. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 tells us that we are to focus on Christ, not the world. But it makes an interesting comparison here. It says to avoid covetousness, which is idolatry. I know covetousness is not a word that you guys use on a regular basis, okay? But what does it mean to covet something?
Pursue.
Pursue, okay? Give me more. What else does it mean?
To want it in a jealous sense.
To want it in a jealous sense, okay? Have you seen, some of your friends are old enough to drive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you see them with a car and you go, ooh, that's a nice car. Is that covetousness?
Mm-hmm.
What about, I would like to have a car like that? Is that covetousness?
No.
What about, they don't deserve that car? Is that covetousness? Yeah, that's where we cross the line, right? They're bad because they have something I want. Or, I'm so good, I deserve that thing. Covetousness leads you to do things like steal and be jealous, right? It leads you to hate people for the things that they have. That's what covetousness does. But Paul says that when you covet, in Colossians chapter 3, he says, when you covet, that is idolatry. What are you doing? When you say, they have something that they don't deserve, or they have something that I deserve, who am I idolizing here?
Yourself.
Myself. That's how covetousness becomes idolatry. Which is why, just like here, Jeroboam said, my brother may control the part where God dwells. He may control Judah, where Jerusalem is, but I deserve to be a leader. Therefore, I'll create these false gods to reinforce my leadership. Or the children of Israel, when they forgot about God, we deserve to have all these things that the nations around us have. Look, they have crops and they have children and they have abundant blessings. We deserve that, so we should serve their God. Or you go back to here where the people got bored and distracted in the case of the golden calf, and they say, you know, we deserve to have a God. We've been down here this whole time. We don't know what's happened to Moses, but we deserve to have a God, so we're going to make one. That's how you go from covetousness to idolatry. That's what Paul's talking about in Colossians chapter 3. Now, are we really any better now? We look at these Old Testament stories and think, what an ignorant people they are, right? But we talked about what we gain by rejecting God. Well, we really gain nothing. That's the true definition here. We don't get anything by rejecting God or forgetting God. But what we think we gain is this stuff over here. We think we gain power. We think we get to become like everyone else. We think we have something new to focus on. That's what we think. Because we have forgotten who we are, who made us, and who we belong to. Sure, you can convince yourself that there are good things about false gods, but none of those good things will ever be real or true. And so the origin of false gods is when people start to look inward and say, what do I want? What do I believe is best? Covetousness. What do I deserve? And out of that comes a fake form of godliness. Now, what we're going to talk about next week, and I had to skip the part about chicken and egg, where because there are so many different world religions, the conclusion that mankind comes to is that, well, there must not be any gods. Under no other circumstance would you take an abundance of data and go, it must all be wrong. Okay? Under any other circumstance, it'd be like, one of these has to be right, so let's try to figure out which one. But instead, when it comes to God, we go, well, because there's a lot of them, they must all be fake. But that's not how any other reasonable line of logic would work. So what we're going to talk about next week is how people come to that conclusion that because there's an abundance of gods, they must all be fake. And in doing so, we put something else in that God-shaped hole, what we're going to call for next week's class, secularism. Okay? All right, so that's what we got for next week. Appreciate you guys listening. If you have questions, let me know. Hugh, can you stop the video? There should be a button down on the bottom that says finish.
Sure can.